Sandy Roger is a dear brother and good friend, and someone I've had the great joy and privilege of working alongside for a period of time. And it was a great joy to talk with him about the great work of preaching recently. So I'm very grateful to you for being willing to be involved in this project and to talk to me about this. I wonder if I could begin just for the few folk who may not know you. Could you give us just a quick introduction to yourself and a sort of brief resume of your ministry journey and experience?
Yes, well, I think the most important thing about me nationally is that I'm a Glaswegian. I was born in Glasgow, was brought up in Glasgow, and was brought up amongst the Methodists in the Central Hall in Glasgow at a time when it was just bursting at the seams with spiritual life. And really, as I look back, those were tremendous influences on my life. I don't think you can underestimate the foundations, although you don't appreciate them at the time. Once the building is constructed, then you realize, oh, I know what this is really built on. And when I look back, I can see people that I obviously admired. One or two I had a sort of hero worship for, and the sense of welcoming into that place of worship, because I came from a non-Christian family. Although there's a strange incident I'll probably tell you sometime this afternoon about my call to preach. But when people say, when were you converted? I usually say at the age of 14 in a scripture union meeting in Allen Glen School in Glasgow, an all-boys school. And I never looked back. One of the things that that early experience did for me was create a tremendous hunger for God's word. And at the same time, now that I look back, I can see that side by side with the hunger, there was a strong desire to share with other people what I was experiencing. That, of course, eventually took me to Bible college. I was at Cliff College, which is Methodist college, which would be the natural place to go. When I finished the course at Bible college, I went on to their evangelistic staff for 5 years, doing team missions in a wide variety of churches throughout England, only once in Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And it was during those years that I began to feel I need more training. And that's when I went to university, and that's when I did theological training. And one of the lecturers at Cliff College, he said, I should be pushing you towards the Methodist ministry, but I think you need to get into the Church of Scotland. So that conversation with him opened up the way for that to happen. My very first charge was on the south side of Glasgow in a place called Newton Mearns, where I was for 10 years. When I was called there, it was a restricted call. In that it was a brand new building. It used to be in the very centre of Glasgow. They moved out and rebuilt, and within a few years of rebuilding, there were major building problems. A modern building, and the lot fell upon Jonah. But by solid preaching, hard work, pastoral ministry, and a good group of elders in leadership, things entirely turned around. And in those 10 years, I saw the congregation grow from about 97, I used to count them nearly every Sunday morning, to about 300. and a couple of hundred on a Sunday night, fed in by people from other congregations who appreciated the teaching, but maybe didn't have anything in the evening. During those years, I was also involved in prison ministry, and at the end of the 10 years at Newton Mearns, there was a vacancy in the Church of Scotland for a national chaplain to the prison service, and I was appointed to that position, and I did that for about 6 years. And my job was to visit every prison in Scotland. In those days, there was 22 of them. To train up the chaplains, to run courses for the chaplains, to hire and fire the chaplains, and it put me in a very strong position in that I could get evangelical ministers into chaplaincy positions. So that was good. I then left that and went down south to actually a United Reformed Church in Beaconsfield just for about 2 years. It didn't work out the way that I had hoped, and I came back, and what I came back to was the principalship of the Faith Mission Bible College, where I was for nearly another 10 years, just under 10 years. And those were great years as far as my own development were concerned, but the interaction with the students was quite powerful. And then I felt, I can't do this forever. You can't stay in any form of academic work for your life without shriveling up spiritually. And I then went back into 2 parishes, one in Coatbridge, very working class on the suburbs of Glasgow, where I was for 6 years. And then another 5 years at Brucefield, which is in West Lothian, traditionally a mining area, I suppose, as well, but also pretty working class. And in both those places, we saw growth from where I eventually retired. And at the moment, what I'm doing is I'm still preaching. I'm still preaching probably far too many Sundays than I should. But I reckon that the need is very, very great. And I've taken on this past year the position at the Faith Mission Bible College of the college chaplain, which means I have responsibility for what happens at the college chapel service on a Friday morning. And I've been doing a little bit of part-time lecturing, but I anticipate that's now coming to an end.
Quite a variety, isn't it? It's
quite a variety, yes. Especially when I contrast it with friends of mine who have been in places. I have a friend who came through university with me who has just retired from the one church after 42 years.
Yeah, yes.
How he has sustained it, I don't know. And, I sometimes have the little question, has that been fair on the people? But only time will tell.
Sandy, looking back, and you hinted on a few months ago, how did you get into preaching? And this is what God has made me for.
Well, I mentioned very briefly there in my sort of introduction an incident that happened in my life. I told you I was quite definitely converted at the age of 14. But when I was about 4 years of age, my father was in the process of decorating a bedroom, and he stopped for a cup of tea, and I crept into the room where he was working and climbed up the ladder as a 4-year-old, and then started to shout at the top of my voice, which of course my mother and father came rushing in to see what all the shouting was about. And when I was asked, what are you doing up there? I said, I'm being the minister. Now, my mother and father were not churchgoers, so they were committed Christians. Although I hasten to add, in relation to many of the family units this day, that there was solid Christian teaching pumped into us, because it was the right thing to do. And it was through them that, of course, I was sent to Sunday school. Now, that happened before I was converted, but I definitely see it as I don't want to put myself on the same level as little Samuel in the temple, hearing the voice of God. There was no voice of God except mine at the top of the ladder. But I think, I believe, because of what I believe about the grace of God and God moving in our lives long before we're aware of it, I believe that was a definite spiritual experience that left some kind of infant mark on me. But okay, you only see these things when you do look back.
Yes.
So that's how I sensed a call. And the other two things that I mentioned again briefly, when I gave my life to Christ in that Scripture Union meeting, the hunger that began to develop within me was insatiable, to know what the Bible meant, what's it all about. I remember one Christmas my mother and father buying me a copy of the New English Bible translation. It was only the New Testament in those days. And immediately, I don't remember the other big present I got that Christmas. I remember that. And I immediately turned to the book of Revelation. At last I'll be able to understand it. And I'm still a bit baffled with the book of Revelation. But that hunger, I think, is an essential ingredient in any preacher, coupled with the desire to make known the riches that you have found. And I know I'm sticking my neck out here, but you can tell a preacher who's been just devouring the word. You can tell a preacher who has a hunger for the words, because that hunger is created within the listeners. So I wouldn't say my call is all that definite, but it's there. And if I would use one word to describe it, I would describe it as a growing sense of call. And I think it's still growing.
Yes, I understand that. Yes. I'm fascinated by the number of men I've talked to in recent weeks, and almost all of them say that sense of call to ministry almost began on day one. It wasn't a sort of life-changing midlife out of the blue. It was almost at conversion. I need to talk to people about Jesus. I need to preach. It's quite striking. I've not come across that so much before. But who were, particularly in the early days, but even since then, who were the influences in your life that shaped you, and as it were, role models and others who helped you become a preacher in your own name?
Well, if I go back to my earliest days in the Methodist Central Hall, the minister in those days was a chap called Harry Hammond. He came from Hull originally, and he was just dynamic. And you can't be involved in even things like the Life Boys and the Boys Brigade without a man like that having some sort of impact and influence upon you. I have one vivid memory of going with the Life Boys. The Life Boys used to meet on a Tuesday night, but in Holy Week, they continued to meet, but they went to the little church service that they were holding in Holy Week. And Harry Hammond, as far as I remember, he was preaching on some aspect of the cross, and the sweat was pouring off the man. He was in this message, and I sat there thinking, this must be very important, you know. So I would name him as an influence, plus some of the leaders in that congregation at the basic level, Sunday school teachers, some of whom I'm still in contact with, and youth leaders. And it was my youth leader that took myself and actually the church organist to the big convention at Cliff College, where I came under the spell of some of those Cliff College evangelists. And I was 16 then, and when you're 16 and somebody else is 23, 24, they're just your hero. So those were definitely influences.
Yeah. So you're this mixture of sort of Scottish Presbyterianism and
I know
Wesleyan revivalism, which is a great combination.
It is a great combination. Yeah. And I mean, if you're talking about influences, I mean, I keep telling people this: you'll have to get to know the Methodist hymn book before you get to heaven.
Yes.
But again, the love that I have for the Wesleyan hymns is because they're all scripture.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, and they're solid. Maybe leaving aside their strong Arminian content, but from time to time you come across things that you think, oh, an Arminian wrote that.
Yes.
That's very interesting. You know, so those are influences. Other influences in my life have been books, particularly in relation to preaching, and I think all the people I'm going to mention now are dead. all the people that influenced me are dead.
It's a sign of old age, brother.
It's a sign of old age.
Yeah.
There was an apostolic minister in Glasgow for a number of years. I only heard him on a few occasions. His name was Ian McPherson. And somehow I came across a book that he had written called The Burden of the Lords. And that book, again, laid a pattern for my own preaching. There's no doubt about that. You know, he talks about the craft of sermon construction. He talks about the sort of man a preacher ought to be. He talks about the actual experience of preaching. And it's a book, I still have it on my shelves, and I go back to it again and again. He wrote it in 1955. So he was writing that book when I was 4. But I feel he was writing it for me. Yes. He must have written it for many other people. And the other book that's been a great influence on me was a series of articles written by a chap called Alexander Gamay. He was a journalist, I think, for the Glasgow Evening Citizen. And he made it his job to go and listen to preachers. And he wrote this book, Preachers I Have Heard. People like Alexander White. He heard him. you know, and a whole list of people. Joseph Parker at the City Temple in London, all these sort of people, and it's a whole spectrum of denominations, and all of them probably broadly evangelical, some more so than others. F.B. Meyer, I heard F.B. Meyer, and all these people, Campbell Morgan.
Yeah.
You know, and he writes down his impression of their preaching.
As you look back, knowing now what you know, what advice would you give your younger self?
I think it's important, if there's the very beginnings of stirrings within you that God might be calling you to be a preacher, listen to other preachers. I think that is the best way to learn about sermon construction, sermon structure, sermon delivery, and again, both in the negative and the positive. There are some people that I have anticipated going to hear preach and been disappointed. There are other people that I couldn't wait long enough to get to hear them preach. And again, I think that feeds into you. So listen to preachers. Nobody told me to listen to preachers, but again, when there was this moving of maybe God pushing me in the direction of a preaching ministry, almost automatically I wanted to hear other people. How do they do it? Although I never sat in the pew thinking, how are they doing this? I think you just imbibe it like your mother's milk.
Yeah.
You know?
That makes sense.
And it's doing you good. So that's certainly advice I would give. And you know this as well, John, that I am an inveterate note taker. I have notes. I've got notes of your sermons somewhere. I like to write things down. And again, when I look back, the very art of note taking was helping me to be constructive in my own sermon technique. So I would certainly give that advice. Listen to preachers, take notes, and keep them. Don't throw them away, you know, and put the guy's name on them as well. Otherwise, you'll think, oh, I don't remember preaching that, but I'll preach it again. You know, and the chap's sitting there in the congregation. I've heard this one before.
Yes. Yeah.
Also, I would advise young preachers, and not everybody agrees with me here, but I would advise you to take a full manuscript into the pulpit. Any idiot can stand up with 3 alliterative points on a piece of paper and waffle. And in some cases, it might not even be waffle, but there won't be much substance to it. You know, the great thing about a manuscript is you have produced it, it's yours. You've gone over it and over it and over it in your preparation. And even if you don't read it, at least it's there as a standby if your mind suddenly goes blank. And we've all had experience of the mind suddenly going blank. And that's when we say the wrong thing or the daft thing, you know.
Yeah, that's right.
So I would give that advice. And this isn't happening to me so much nowadays, although it does when I preach in my home church. If it's within your hands to lead the service, make sure your preparation is done well. You know, most places I go to preach now in retirement, I'm only there to preach. I don't think the preaching is the be all and end all of a whole service of worship. And if you have thought through your own hymns and thought about the areas that you're going to tread when it comes to prayer, even if you've got to do the children's talk, I've found it very fruitful over the years to tie up my children's talk with what I know I'm going to be saying in the message, because adults listen to children's talks, and very often that's the thing they mention at the door.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
well, I thought, well, if you listen to that, then I can plant a seed in your mind so that when I come to that point that I want to go into at an adult level in the message, then the ground will already be prepared.
Yeah, yeah.
And one last piece of advice I would give: if you're invited to preach, don't turn it down because it's a wee place. I've come across a number of preachers who say, oh no, I wouldn't go there. There's only a handful. Well, those handful might be God's people that need the word.
Amen. Yeah.
In that book by Alexander Gami, Preachers I Have Heard, he tells a story, a rather sad story, about Joseph Parker, when he was at the height of his fame in the City Temple in London. And he got an invitation to come and preach at a little country chapel somewhere for their anniversary. And he sent them a postcard, writing on the postcard, an eagle does not perch on a sparrow's nest.
Wow.
You know?
Yeah.
And Gami in the book says, I'm glad that was said of Joseph Parker and not Joseph Parker's Lord.
Amen.
And that's it.
A good answer. Yeah, yeah. That's sad. Very sad, isn't it?
It's quite sad.
Very sad. Yeah, yeah.
But you do see it, John.
You do. Oh, I see it. I see it. Yeah.
Among ministers.
Yes.
And it's the main cause of jealousy and envy.
Yes. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right.
What can any of us boast of?
Tragic. Absolutely tragic.
You know, all we've got is what we've received. Right. Same as you. Same as them.
Yeah. Exactly right. Yeah. So, Sandy, to put it kindly, you've been preaching for a good number of years. What aspect of preparation and preaching do you find the most, at this point, the most demanding, the most testing? You have to apply yourself. And has that changed over the years, or is that a fairly constant?
The aspect that I still feel, I don't know what word to use, the time factor, I think, is important. And particularly once you get into a pastoral situation and you've got 1,001 other things to do, it's the easiest thing in the world to say, oh well, I'm doing the work pastorally. You know, if you're called to be a preacher, that's your main task. And if you haven't got the time to do it, I think you've got to make time.
Mm-hmm.
Time is of the essence. In all the years I was in parish ministry, again, looking back, Tuesday was my day for preparing the bulk of what I was going to be doing the following Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
And I was happy if on by a Tuesday evening, I had everything in place for the following Sunday morning. I could leave later in the week anything I was doing at night. But I think that the time factor is, the time factor is important. Because if you're called to be a preacher, that's your main calling.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there are so many things to sidetrack you from it.
Yeah.
Although I've got to say there are too many ministers who say, "Well, I've not got time to visit
Mm-hmm.
because my main work is preaching." And you want to say to them, "Yeah, but I've listened to your preaching." And I don't know if you're spending the time on it that you say you are.
Right. Okay. Yes.
Plus, if you did even a little pastoral work, you would find that is a great help in your preaching.
No doubt.
None of us preach in a vacuum, especially if we're in a pastoral situation. We're preaching to people that we need to know and ought to know.
Yes, and that helps the application, how this word sits with the folk in front of us.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
I think it's also important. The phrase I would use here is to pray the whole message into your heart and mind. I don't mean you get down on your knees with your manuscript in front of you and turn it into a prayer, but isn't there a verse somewhere in Jeremiah where he talks about a fire burning within his bones? I think that's what we're aiming for every time. So that by the time Sunday comes, you can't wait to get to that pulpit, not because you think you're great, but because you've got something to say that you feel God has given you from his works. If I can go back to Ian McPherson's book, he uses the illustration of being pregnant with the words. Now, I don't know what it feels like to be pregnant, but he develops this along the lines of it must be like carrying a child in your womb, and eventually there comes a time when the child bursts forth and there's life. And he says that's what we should be aiming at for our messages. We carry it in the womb of our mind, and in the preparation process, particularly if we were preaching on something 3 weeks in advance.
Yes.
It's amazing how it can grow and develop, but there comes a point where it bursts forth.
That's right.
Which I suppose is what the 8th century prophets were emphasizing when they talked so often about the burden of the Lord being upon them.
Yes, that's good. Thank you. That's helpful, Sandy. One last question. I'd like your observation on this. As you look at, if you like, the preaching scene, what encourages you, but what concerns you? Where do you see the weak points, if you like, the flaws? I'm assuming there's things that encourage you, but I'm hoping so.
Yes, yeah, I think they do, but on the whole, at the present time, and it may be because of my age and my background, I don't see much evidence of preachers, because all the emphasis is not on the preaching.
Mm.
That's true. Well, it's true in churches that are put their emphasis liturgically. It's true on churches that have a liberal focus. They can talk about anything they like under the sun. But if you claim to be an evangelical, if you claim to be a Bible-believing Christian, then you're tied to the word.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, I see a great lack there. I do see a great lack there. And again, I think it's tied up with the fact that most of our young people are not hearing preachers.
Yes.
What I said right at the beginning.
Yeah.
You know, where would you go? If I've got a free Sunday night, thankfully here in Edinburgh, there's quite a number of people I can go and listen to and know that I'm going to get something. But there are plenty more places where if I go on a Sunday night, I'll get a workshop.
Yeah.
I'll get a music festival. I'll get a drama event. You know, and these things have their place, but I don't think the place is on a Sunday night.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
So I'm sorry to come across so. That's not very encouraging. But yes. But it's like the tide at Southport. The tide always comes back.
Yes.
I know it's a long way out at Southport, but
yes,
it turns.
Yes, yes.
But you long to see it turning in your own day.
Amen. Yeah.
When I look back to the churches that I have pastored, every single one of them was built on teaching the word.
Mm.
The other thing I find, I wouldn't say discouraging, but I have a little question mark over it. There are various organisations that seem to teach people to preach. And it worries me that they are being taught by people who aren't preachers.
I know exactly what you mean. Yeah. Yeah.
You
know? Yeah. Yeah.
And you'll hear some of these prodigies stand up, and their exposition of the text is fine, but it's lacking in application. It's lacking in spiritual oomph.
Yes. Yes.
You know, because there seems to be a belief in some evangelical circles that all you need to do is correctly interpret the word. Well, we do need to interpret the word correctly. Of course we do.
Sure. Yeah.
But there's more to preaching than that.
Absolutely.
More to preaching than that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And a whole generation, maybe 2, maybe 3 generations have now grown up who have never sat under preaching.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, it's a sad observation, but you're dead right. If folk aren't having the opportunity, as you say earlier, to witness and hear what real preaching is, that's not going to light that fire within them. I want to do that. I can do that. They're hearing dry as dust lectures sometimes at the very best. Yeah. And that puts people off, quite frankly, in my experience. Yeah.
Or it doesn't put them off. It makes them think, this is what preaching is meant to be.
Yes. Yeah. It's not a good model, is it? No.
Sometimes you get more vitality in a liberal preacher.
I know what you mean. Yeah, I know. Yeah. And that's also what gives expository preaching a bad name, because sometimes it's just a verse by verse lecture. Well, pick up a commentary and read it then.
Yes.
You know, it's not preaching though, as I understand preaching. There's no fire there. There's no energy. There's no fire but in the bones in these situations. No. So, Sandy, I'm really grateful to you, brother. It's always refreshing to talk with you, and like iron sharpening iron. And, so I'm grateful for you taking the time and sharing your insights.
Yeah. Knowing that I was going to be talking with you this afternoon, there have been two verses in the Bible going round in my mind, which I would like to think, but it's for others to judge. I would like to think that I've taken these as markers in my ministry. There's the verse in John chapter 1, round about verse 37 or 38, where it's speaking of John the Baptist. It says, they heard John say this and followed Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's what any preacher wants. Mm-hmm. But by all means, come and hear me.
Yes.
But follow Jesus.
That's great.
And the other verse is the classic one, of course, from 2 Corinthians 4. We preach not ourselves, but ourselves as your servants for Christ's sake. You know, we preach not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord. And ourselves, where do we fit in? Ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake.
How does he escape the horrible thought that God has done something bad, or that God hates him, or that God does not care about him? But Job, in this most extraordinary thing, he continues to love and trust God. Does it mean he doesn't feel the pain? Not at all. In fact, I suspect the pain is even worse.